So hi everyone, welcome. I'm Dania Putri from the Transnational Institute, and I'm speaking with you from Rabat, Morocco. Welcome to our second webinar of this series on the world with drugs, legal regulation through a development lens. So today we're going to talk about cultural, traditional, and indigenous rights. This series is hosted by Health Poverty Action in collaboration with 7 other organizations: International Drug Policy Consortium, Transform Drug Policy Foundation, Transnational Institute, Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, Institut Toria, Interdisciplinary Center for Cannabis Research, and the Legal Regulation Project. So with regard to the format, we'll first hear an intervention of about 8 minutes from each of our 4 speakers today, after which I might ask a couple of follow-up questions. Then we will have our Q&A at the end, and we get a chance to read some questions from you. To our panelists, please kindly mute your microphone. Thank you. Yeah, so throughout the webinar, you would be able to use the chat box to engage with one another. Please use the Q&A function on Zoom if you want to ask questions to the panelists. And of course, you would be able to join us on Twitter, join the conversation by using the hashtag #OurWorldWithDrugs. And please keep in mind, if you would like to engage with or engage in the chat box, please send your message to all panelists and attendees to make sure that everyone can see your message. And of course, we'll also be posting some relevant links there in the chat box. So please keep an eye out for that. For your information, this webinar is also being recorded. The chat will also be saved later on to also feed into our summary report, which we'll produce at the end of the series. So yeah, please keep that in mind when interacting with one another in the chat box as well. So why this webinar, right? As many of us know, the war on drugs is rooted in racist and cultural imperialism. For over 60 years, we have lived with prohibition-based drug policies. These have disproportionately harmed Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as various communities in the Global South. So think of racially targeted law enforcement, mass incarceration, crop eradication, socioeconomic exclusion, to name only a few. But in many parts of the world, the cultivation and use of drugs is in fact central to people's culture. Plants like coca, cannabis, opium, and so many others have long been used for various traditional purposes. This began centuries or even millennia ago, long before the world's largest colonial powers gathered and planted the seeds of drug prohibition in the early 20th century. From Sumatra to North Africa to the Caribbean, cannabis has long been used as folk medicine and as part of various spiritual practices. It's even included as one of the many anti-inflammatory agents listed in Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine. This book was used as a prominent medical textbook in Europe well into the 17th century. The similar goes for opium poppy, whose medicinal uses, for example, to treat pain, are very much well recorded from Myanmar, India, to the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the coca leaf has been considered sacred by many Andean peoples for thousands of years, and it is central to the Andean culture and identity. Of course, these are only the tip of the iceberg, right? There are so many other examples of traditional uses of psychoactive substances worldwide. So, attendees, tell us what you know about these traditions in the chat box. Please feel free to share more examples that you know of from your respective communities or from wherever you are at the moment. Now, in recent years, we've been seeing more and more countries embracing legal regulation. Governments are reforming laws to allow legal production, trade, and use of certain drugs, be it for the sake of public health, economic recovery, or simply to welcome the waves of commercialization, especially for the cannabis sector. At the same time, though, traditional farmers remain largely excluded from decision-making processes. Large companies are making billions of manufacturing controlled substances, including using cannabis and opioids. But traditional growers and other rural workers who use and produce medicines that are more herbal and traditional in nature are often marginalized, their knowledge and expertise underestimated, or even worse, stolen. Meanwhile, Black and Indigenous people and other communities of color are systematically disenfranchised still. They've endured violence for centuries. They have long faced the brunt of the war on drugs. Yet still, they face significant barriers to simply survive, let alone to start a business in the new legal industry. So, in the wake of all this, how can we ensure that cultural, traditional, and indigenous rights are placed at the heart of drug policy reform? And how can we make sure that the fulfillment of these rights is not done at the expense of other equally important human rights, such as economic rights? And more importantly, how do we legally regulate and support our collective efforts to achieve the sustainable development goals and leave no one behind? Of course, legal regulation is not a silver bullet. Legal regulation alone cannot overcome these issues, but they can contribute to addressing them. Regardless, legal regulation is already happening, and it's important that we make sure that the regulation model that is on the table resembles one that helps to achieve sustainable development and actively supports and involves communities on the ground. As stated by the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, cultural rights are an integral part of human rights and, like other rights, are universal, indivisible, and interdependent. So, there goes my introduction. Without further ado, let's welcome our first speaker, Vicky Hanson. Vicky is a coordinator at the Interdisciplinary Center for Cannabis Research in Jamaica. She works closely with various groups of traditional growers in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean region, while she also stays active in advocacy work at the regional and international level. So welcome, Vicky. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you. Welcome all to this very important webinar. Looking forward to the conversations that we will have as well. Let me thank the various groups for facilitating this discussion as well. I would like to start where Dania left off in terms of the importance of our cultural rights and cultural rights being human rights. And we are approaching this, and I approach my discussion in the form of a presentation on the Caribbean and looking at the Caribbean, but specifically Jamaica. And what you'll find is some of the characteristics in Jamaica can be mirrored throughout the Caribbean region. All right, so for example, we start our relationship with cannabis, or ganja as we call it in the Caribbean, long before the rules for psychotropic drugs and the UN Convention on Drugs in 1971 and so on. Our history of the use of cannabis goes back to our, we don't call them indigenous people, but we call them traditional groups, our Maroons, who were runaway slaves from the plantation back in the days of slavery. And so these persons would have gone into the hills in rural Jamaica and in other Caribbean islands and created their own community where they would use their traditional practices, cannabis being part of that traditional practice of healing, of herbs and spices. The Maroons are known to use cannabis with a lot of things and to use it even in their kumina or revival session, their worship session, which is heavily linked to their African heritage. So, well, I only have 8 minutes. I'm giving you a quick history in one. So they would use cannabis for healing. They'll use cannabis in their religious practices. And they'll use cannabis when they take baths. They have these spiritual baths for cleansing that they would use it in. Fast forward to the early 1930s when we are now also pushing for independence, and we are pushing against the colonial power, we have the evolution of a Rastafari community. And the Rastafari community, heavily attached and see their ancestral roots in Africa, also came to use cannabis, again using their religious practices in their worship of Haile Selassie or of a Jack Rastafari. And so the use of cannabis by the Rastafarian community and the acceptance of cannabis was seen as something as rebelling against colonial power. It's something that would facilitate them using this plant in their food, in their religious practices for higher knowledge. It is said, and there are scriptures in the Bible, and Ross Iaview is one of our panelists who say more, but it is said that it was found on King Solomon's grave, and King Solomon is identified with the lineage of Haile Selassie going back. And so the Rastafari movement and ganja became one, cannabis became one. So it is seen as part of their way of life. And so there was the pinnacle, one of the original Rastafari community that engaged in the growing and the cultivation of ganja as a means of development and sustainable economic development for their community, as well as a means of using it for their religious and health practices. And so ganja was used with white rum at the time, with other herbs and spices put in a bottle to heal when someone had pain. One of the ancients got sick and had pain, and they would rub that in the area. So that traditional medical use was used, that traditional involvement of the cultivation of the crop of cannabis to trade, to bring income into that initial community in the pinnacle where the Rastafari originated from, had that connection there. As I said, it was also used as part of their religious practices and so on. So we would have started that use from way before we had the conventions on drugs to make these psychotropic drugs illegal. And they were used as means of development, health and well-being and economic development. Now we now have a space, an international space that is governed by these regulations, these international rules that says the use of these plants are prohibited because of the reaction that they give, notwithstanding the historical use by these traditional groups within the Caribbean, the Maroons and the Rastafari. Yet still you would have had, and I see Dania mentioning the UN regulations that come in the early 1970s now that spoke to your own rights of your human rights, your cultural rights, right? So in 1976, we decided that, okay, we need to have a convention on cultural, economic, social, and cultural rights. Okay, so that is good. However, what is the tension now? Because you have a law that prohibits the use of these plants because of their psychotropic use. However, you are also having a law now that speaks to respecting the cultural and economic rights of traditional groups, indigenous groups. You know, you have the Indigenous Rights Act Covenant. And so that is where, for me, there is that tension, and that tension leads to lack of development and understanding of development, because you now have a situation where, while my culture and my traditional practice accepts that I use cannabis to worship whomever you call it, whether you're God or your deity, and you use cannabis in a traditional way, it's not your regular modern day European medicinal style of use of the plant or cannabis or which are other plants. And so I've used it in my traditional way. You're telling me that that is illegal by way of your convention on drugs and psychotropic substances. However, in your other covenant, you said that everything must be done to respect my cultural rights. My rights and our cultural rights is something that we would have developed over time. It's accepted by our people over time. And so now, how is that going? So now you make cultivation of cannabis on a large scale by communities illegal, or you make it so now in recent times in 2015, I have to get a license to cultivate. And when I need to get that license is saying, okay, I need to cultivate under certain circumstances. Where is the, so you are seeing the tension between one set of rules and regulations that is asking me to respect my rights. So for example, in Jamaica, we have what we call a sacramental rights for the Rastafari. However, in that sacramental right that the rule gives, the UN Convention and UN Report on Just have said to us, we are contravening the UN law, because nothing in the UN law allows for sacramental rights of the use of these plants. So that is the tension that Caribbean countries such as Jamaica and other Caribbean Central and Benitez will have to treat with a set of people in the Rastafari community. Now, the problem with that also is that we have not recognized the Maroons' traditional rights to use the plant. So there is that tension now as well. So Maroons will continue to use this plant in an illicit space because they only allow homegrown plants, but then you need more than that. So again, based on those, we now have these tensions. And I will answer and clarify some of these issues further in the question and answer, just to give you an idea and give persons and the participants an idea. We now have those tensions where you are saying to these traditional growers, go and get a license to do what you would normally have done culturally. You now need to follow these rules and regulations, and your cultural and traditional standards are not necessarily accepted, because these persons do not grow and cultivate the cannabis outside of their cultural standards. They have cultural and traditional, for example, Rastafari will tell you they grow cannabis under the ITAL standards, which talks about protecting the environment, which talks about not using certain chemicals to destroy the plant and other plant life and so on. So we're dealing with an environment that it's all encompassing, and that is not taken into consideration when we're looking at the development issue and the development of regulations. And so development is seen and regulatory frameworks are being built on certain standards, but not taken into consideration, seriously taken into consideration, our cultural and social rights. So these are some of the things that we have to definitely look at, and we have to bring apart the international laws and rules, because you cannot have the psychoactive, the convention on psychoactive substances saying one thing, and then you have a cultural and rights convention saying something else that should lead to development. And so I leave this part of the discussion with a question to say, whose development? And how do we see development? Because development is not just contextualized in a certain type or standard. So that's the thing I'll throw out there. Whose development is development? Then we can pick it up a discussion. So those are just some of the points I'd like to put on the table.
Thanks a lot, Vicky. Those were some very important questions, and I'm very glad that you reminded us of the fact that human rights obligations should always take precedence over any international agreements. And even the 1988 UN Convention against illicit traffic in narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances states as well that measures to prevent illicit cultivation shall respect fundamental human rights and shall take due account of traditional licit uses where there is historic evidence of such use. So thanks a lot for bringing that up. And this brings us to our next speaker. I think Rasaya V is with us. Rasaya, can you hear us okay? Welcome. Oh, looks like we're having a bit of a technical issue.
Okay, so he's hearing you guys, but apparently you're not hearing him. So I can keep my mic open and he can
Okay.
feel it from the mic. So if you can hear me. Go ahead, Rasaya.
Okay, well, first let me say greetings to all the participating in the name of His Majesty Haile Selassie, in the name of all those who have fought for equal rights and justice. I would just like to start by using the words of His Majesty that Bob Marley sang. Until the philosophy that holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned. Until there is no more first class and second class citizens of any nation. Until the color of a man's skin is of no more significance than the color of his eyes. Until bigotry, maliciousness, and inhuman self-interest is replaced by goodwill and understanding. Then the dream of true lasting peace, world citizenship, and the rule of international morality will become a fleeting illusion to be pursued but never attained. Here will the war. I say this because slavery and colonialism damage to people, especially countries that are considered to be third world countries now. Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Asia. And because of that, I think it is because of the happenings over the years, the negative impact of slavery and colonialism, why we are having this webinar settings at the moment. I say that again because for years, I mean, a world with drugs, what some people, and even the United Nations and even Europeans in general, would call drugs. For us and other, indigenous groups and people over the world, these plants are medicinal plants. These plants are religious plants. And so for other people, other countries, or European people to come and enforce laws on these people saying that you cannot use these plants because these plants are drugs. So and I as Rastafari, it is a violation of these people, human rights, their birth rights, and their constitutional rights. Nobody has the right to impose their way of life on other people. It is the right of everybody, every nation, every country to self-determination. And if people in South America choose to use coca plants and peyote and mushroom, they are medicinal and religious plants. Who are European people to come because these international drug convention that comes out of the United Nations is pushed by the Euro-America system. And for that to be happening, it will eventually lead to war because nobody wants anybody to come and impose their way of life on them. And like I said the other day, if in France wine is their thing, give thanks. Go ahead and drink your wine, that's your culture. If in other people's country, cannabis and poppy and coca plants is their culture, then they have the right to chew their coca plants as they used to. We have the right to use cannabis how we want to, whether we want to eat it, we want to juice it, or for whatever reason. So I am saying that I'm glad that the United Nations is there. I'm glad for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. But I'm hoping that people will come out and take a stand against what I consider to be injustice. Because these people, a lot of these youth, have ended up in prison for having coca leaves in their possession, using coca for cultural or medicinal or religious point of view. And same thing has been happening with Anna Rastafari and with other black people here in the Caribbean and other parts of the world. We have been going to prison for a plant plant that the Almighty, whoever, whatever you would consider the Almighty to be, these plants were put here by the Almighty, just as how man and woman was put here by the Almighty. I don't see anybody having the right to make laws against something that was created by state power that created man and woman. As such, again, I call on the international community, I call on the United Nations, because there are aspects of the International Narcotics and Convention that violate the rights of Rastafari people and other indigenous groups who choose to are considered as drugs, who choose to use these plants from different points, like medicinally, culturally, religiously. So again, I call on the international community to join hands, because if there is no justice, there will be no peace. And I would like to say again, with the word of His Majesty, that throughout history, it is the silence of the voice of justice when it matters most that has enabled evil to triumph. It is the inaction of those who should have and could have acted, the indifference of those who should have known better, and the silence of the voice of justice when it matters most that has enabled evil to triumph. That's what I would like to say this morning. Give thanks for having me and honor your panel.
Thank you so much, Josiah. Thank you for that. Thank you for those powerful words and for raising some of those important concerns that that have been there for a while, especially when it comes to the lack of connection between economic and cultural rights, and oftentimes we see these rights as mutually exclusive. Just a quick note to the attendees. Apologies for the technical difficulty, and I said this in the chat, but please bear with us when it comes to involving certain members of communities on the ground, especially those people from certain areas where internet connection is not always 100% available 24/7. This is a recurring challenge that we face. And so Vicky, would you be so kind to give just a very quick recap of the key
Yes,
points?
Dania, I most definitely will be, because what I had been trying to say and has said is that the traditional groups, whether they be in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and the Caribbean, there must be some respect for their cultural rights to use whatever plants they have been using culturally, and to use it whether to worship their particular deity or in a way to give them their own development. He points to the importance and the philosophy of Rastafari residing in the words of His Majesty, that states that until all cultures are accepted equally across the world, these conventions will be one that is restrictive to the growth and development of the cultures and the diversity that exists. And so there would be no development until there is that acceptance, peace in His word, peace plus development, until there is an acceptance that each culture, all cultures are equal in their rights and standing. And one culture is not more important than the other. And so the international rules that are built should not just focus on one culture. And this is important coming from Ras IFE, because he's speaking, as you highlighted, Dania, in your recap, he's speaking from the ground. That's a lived experience from someone. This is an elder in the Nyabingi order of Rastafari, which is one of the original order of that group. And so their livity and their use of these plants are dear and interwoven in their culture, in the cultural perspective. And so to say to them that they must be now regulated and they must only grow for just that use of license and only what they can use sacramentally without giving them the space to allow them to use the plant for development is problematic. And that is, in summary, what Ross IFV is creating. I hope he'll be able to join us for the question and answer section, very much more clearer.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Vicky and Rosayavi. Those are some very important points. And just to remind everyone here that even the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and other people working in rural areas also highlights the right to an adequate standard of living for themselves and for their families, and to facilitate access to the means of production necessary to achieve them. So this is the thing with human rights, right? It's not for cherry picking. We cannot just pick and choose which rights are suitable for which people at which times. So thanks again for reminding us that not only do we have to respect and comply with cultural, traditional, and indigenous rights, but also we need to continue upholding other basic human rights, like the right to live in dignity, the right to food, and many others. So let's move on to our next speaker. Welcome, Cylone. Cylone is a senior advisor at the Myanmar Opium Farmers Forum. Cylone is a descendant of opium farming family from Kengtung, the capital of Golden Triangle, Eastern Shan State, Myanmar. He's one of the founders of the Myanmar Opium Farmers Forum, and he's currently working as a consultant with TNI's Myanmar drug program in protecting the rights and promoting the voices of opium farmers. So welcome, Cylone. Over to you. Oh, I think you are still on mute. Speaking about voices.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for your nice introduction. So, yeah, let me start with the opium in Myanmar. So for the opium cultivation in Myanmar, we can trace back in the literature, you can trace back to 19th century. But actually with the, with the people folk tale, and then so it's much longer than that. So in present day, if you look at why people, why farmer growing opium, is especially that some other factors. So especially for the poverty, I think that this. So, and then also the conflict, the political instability. And another important factors is about the traditional use and medicinal value of opium. So, yes. So opium has many advantages to solve all those, I mentioned all the problem. So one is the opium is a short-term crop. So it is a kind of crop that you can harvest within 100 days of cultivations. So easy to cultivate and all that. It can resist to extreme weather of the high elevations. So all those, and it is a high value that farmers can get income to solve their family, the food security, and also daily life needs. Yeah? So another one is the opium is quite easy to store, so it's have a ready market. So the one important thing is about the cultural and the traditional medicine use, and also the culture and social use. So in the highland of Myanmar, so people use opium to kill almost every illness of the high elevation, such as diarrhea, dysentery, malaria, asthma, and fevers, and all those all those so all those illness that you can just mention. So we can use the people use opium as a traditional medicine to kill all those illness. So one important thing is people also use opium to tame the wild animals. So like elephants, buffalo, oxen. So that they can use for as a draft animals. So some women even said that you can also use opium to tame or pacify the violent husband. That is what the people in Myanmar say. So another important thing is about the social use and the cultural use. So opium, so because it has been in this area for so long, so it's also involved in all the social life, like weddings, marriage, all the processing. So it also part of the dowry that you have to give to the girl parents, and yeah, and we also use this in housewarming, and also some religious ritual, social ritual. So in funerals, so and also that welcoming important leaders when they visit us. So another thing we also use as a in the belief that so we also use opium to make offering to spirits. So and people also believe of the charming magic of the opium. So we believe that if you bring opium with you, so in hunting, so you can get more animals in hunting. You can avoid the poisonous creature, poisonous animals, and also to avoid that the evil that in the jungles. So some people even believe that so you can also the opium have the magic that you can avoid casualty in fighting. So we have some story about that ethnic armed revolutionary group. So when they are going fighting, so usually they bring opium with them to avoid that. So it's, we have one story from one ethnic armed group in southern Shan state. So they send one of their platoon to assist their alliance in the KNU when they have a big fighting with the government troop. So all those, after the fighting finished, all the soldiers, they came back untouched. So so that makes it quite very curious for their KNU, the grand ethnic armed group, that asked them why, so what are the secrets? So they show them in the pocket, that they show them the opium. So they bring the opium with them. So they return back to the southern Chan safely. So yeah, that kinds of belief is so related to the religious, to the people belief. So yeah, I also have some other story, but yeah, because due to the time limitations, I will end my discussion. So people in Myanmar, especially people from highland region of Myanmar, we call opium the gift from heavens. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Mhm. Yes, thank you so much,
Yeah,
Salo.
that's
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those interesting examples. It's very useful to hear these concrete examples. And I'm sure we would be able to get back to some of your points later on during the discussion. So now I'd like to welcome our fourth speaker. Last but not least, we have Patricia Schulfer Benitez. Patricia is a social communicator, independent artist, registered with the Ministry of Culture and Tourism of the plurinational state of Bolivia. She's the founder and executive director of Acción Semilla Foundation. It's a young institution that contributes to the improvement of a better drug policy in Bolivia with research, lobby, and projects for vulnerable and affected populations. So Patricia, please go ahead and start.
Thanks, Dania, for the introduction, and thanks everyone to having organized this webinar that is really, really important, especially for us. I want to thank you. Because Bolivia really needs that chance to discuss in this kind of topics right now, because we're going through a very complicated time. So there are some topics that we must discuss, like this, that is especially related to drug decolonization, right? So I would like to start talking about my people, talking about my country, because to talk about decolonization is really important to locate the place, what we are talking about, right? So Bolivia is a country with 11 million people located in the heart of South America, with 36 ethnic groups currently recognized by the state constitution of 2009. So we gave the first liberty freedom revolution of America 195 years ago, but to be born as a republic has not changed one of our most important cultural habits, or one of our biggest economic asset, as it is the coca leaf. Bolivian coca growers from Los Yungas, that is the ancestral territory, had been represented politically always, but it gets more visible at the first stage of coca diplomacy when Bolivia and Peru got the achievement of the inclusion of a paragraph in the 1988 Convention about respecting human rights and traditional uses that I'm sure you mentioned it before. So it's 50 years since the coca growers in Bolivia have been formed as a structured union force, resulting from the demand of North America's frontal fight against drugs. It has been 14 years since the revaluation of the coca leaf has become a policy, and 7 years since our readherence to the single convention with a reservation allows us traditional uses inside the country. So basically, the base for this new policy was intended to be for decolonizing our drug policy, but did not consider other substances just because they were not for ancestral consumption. And that's our main problem to talk about decolonization of drug policy in Bolivia, because on one hand you have the coca leaf policy, the 906 law, and on the other hand you have another law that treats especially illicit drugs. So when we talk about coca leaf, we talk about the National Strategy for Integral Development of Coca leaf. And we can mention some difficulties for its implementation by now, such as transferring economic resources to municipal governments for execution of projects, because local governments are still weak in their structure, administrative, technical, and legal. And all those problems affect the lack of research and innovation that now paralyze different opportunities, such as industry or marketing. So here comes the main question. It was like, how do we ensure that legal regulation of drug decolonizes? Well, with integral development, we were supposed to go beyond that. Integral development means to be a policy of common and shared responsibility. Its effectiveness will depend on the institutional strengthening of the state, and that means a lot of work. So Decolonization goes beyond the last government or the current one. It's just a way of seeing life, our history, and our social space. We still have to look at and learn from our own experience, trying with this law, trying with this new way of confronting the drug policy, understanding our most invisible needs, our structural problems and dynamics, looking so deep that we can deconstruct mental structures that has taken us out of the community sphere, that the community is like the base of all what Bolivians movement dynamics and economics goes around. So we have to go back to that community sphere, because we have got into a bureaucratic system that does not allow us to keep on growing in that sense. So beyond that, political will is like the most important thing to develop this decolonizing thinking. Political will and real revaluation of the coca leaf is needed beyond speech. That's basically one of the biggest problems when we talk about decolonization in Bolivia, because all this process has been like stopped or got stuck because our structural problems.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you so much. I think you already touched on some of my questions that I would like to ask, actually. Yeah, so thank you for sharing your perspectives from Bolivia. And just a quick reminder to all attendees, so please start sharing your questions for the panelists in the Q&A section. And before we start reading them, I'm just curious to hear from our other speakers about the issue of decolonization. And I think Patricia has already touched upon some of these issues. And in my experience and other colleagues' experiences as well, we've seen that in the past decades, the colonially rooted infrastructures that uphold the war on drugs have also created these new forms of colonialism, right? New forms of other exploitative structures and structures of power in so many different parts of the world, including in the global south. And these structures have, of course, been also taken advantage of by the political elite, if you will. And all of these dynamics have made it even more difficult for us to decolonize drug policies and to help communities and help ourselves, I guess, because many of us are part of these communities, to reclaim all these long lost connections and long lost traditions with substances like cannabis, coca, opium, peyote, and many others. And so we've noticed that, you know, perhaps in the development sector, in the drug policy reform sector, we've begun using terms like, we need to decolonize drug control and drug policies, and we need to decolonize development. But what does it actually mean, right? Especially for communities on the ground, including and particularly those who have long endured the harms of the war on drugs and are now excluded from legal regulation. So perhaps some of you are willing to share a little bit more, maybe Vicky or Silone or Rasaya. What does decolonization of drug policy and maybe even also of development mean to you? And what should a decolonized legal regulation look like in your view?
All right. So let me try and answer that. And it's a very important question. But because in the Caribbean and in Jamaica, what we're finding is that the matter of decolonizing drug policy is critical, because we're finding we want to change our laws. We want, and someone asked a question in the book of the conventions and the rules. But we want to change our laws. We want to be able to use cannabis in the way we best see fit, our own local-based environment and our own society. But the challenge with that is that we're constrained by, I call some of them new colonial powers and existing colonial powers. We as former British colonies we're constrained by what is deemed as the European led regulations and legislation. And so in amending our Dangerous Drugs Act, we had legislators who not, in some cases where they could, as you would find in the case of the Rastafari, they looked at our local environment. And I remember our foreign affairs minister coming to the UN at UNGAS and stating that one of the reasons why we actually allowed a sacramental use of the plant by Rastafari only was because of what was happening on the ground, and the Rastafari movement was a great agitation, and in a political climate they had to take that into consideration. However, you still had the Maroons, you still had Rastafari who wanted to engage in the trade of this crop between their communities and others that weren't allowed to do so when they had traditionally been doing so amongst themselves and amongst other groups in the society. Now they would have to do and get licensed, and they would have to go put in track and trace for plants. So they will have to tag each plant from seed to sale. That is not something realistically, if you've been to any ganja cultivation in the Caribbean, that is not something that they are used to. They will tell you how many pounds of plant, how many plants can give you how many pounds and kilos of cannabis for you to use. But they can't, they will not, they are not known to be tagging plants and to be sending reports so that you can get it at the regulators to send to the United Nations for tracking and tracing. And this is what this new regulatory framework that we are now trying to implement in terms of a medicinal cannabis is doing. So we are still following along the colonial lines of how to do things. You're talking about societies where property rights hand down from generation, from family to family. So you have a Rastafari community for the last 50 years living in Westmoreland, in Orange Hill. The Nyabingi order have their own lands from traditionally, and now you're asking for the rules and the legislation that they must bring in land titles. They must show that they are owners and property rights owners of these land that their grandparents and generation have been on. The Maroons, for example, signed a treaty with the British when they ran away in the 1800s to have their own free villages and govern themselves under their Maroon government. Now you're asking them to get a license to participate. So these are some of the colonial strictures that still remains within these societies. And so to say that this must be do away with to facilitate development. My question goes back to my question. Why can't we have development that recognize the importance of these traditional groupings, whether they be in the Caribbean or Latin America or Asia, that build a life and a culture on these plants? And I think this is a discussion, and I saw Mary sent it, that we have been having from the Hemshek Declaration amongst the traditional growers. So it is something that we have to move away from the colonial thinking, and our governments have been trying to rearrange these rules and regulatory framework along the colonial line. It is what our former colonial masters put in place that we have to follow, and our new age colonial masters such as the US and whomever else that we need to follow, and not necessarily things that are built from our ground up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow, those are very powerful words, Vicky, and I wish we could go on for hours on this topic, but just a quick question. Patricia, do you have anything to add to that before we move on?
Yes, thank you. Well, that question you just gave us is really important. No, when you say like, what should a decolonized legal regulation look like? Because you think about it a lot of time. It's like here in Bolivia you have a regulation of coca leaf. That is the law 906. It was launched at 2017, if I'm not wrong, or maybe 2018, but is practically new. And it has a lot of issues because, as I was saying, all the structure in Bolivia was kind of not ready to get something like that. Even though Bolivia was thinking about decolonization like years ago, is kind of historic of us. But how do you do that? That's the real question. So, in my point of view, decolonized drug policy would not be repressive for growers, and it still remains with that colonial thinking. A decolonized drug policy would emphasize on transnational organized crime instead of micro traffickers or consumers. That's one of the hardest thing of our drug policy, because you have a law that takes care about coca leaf, but you have another law that is taking care of illicit drug market, but it's really punitive to the people. So today the policy of revaluation of the coca leaf is in dispute, but when we talk about other substances, we continue under the same punitive structure of 32 years ago, that it is the law 1008. So we have this very complex situation or scenario where you are trying to make a decolonization of your sacred plant, but you're not considering the other problems, the other aspects of the drug issue, drug phenomenon. So I think we still have to change our chip, our internal chip, because we're still, I think we're still on with that point of view of repressing and I don't know, not being flexible or understandable to the human rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Patricia. Yeah, I think those are some very big topics for us to think about, right? So let me just go on to some of the questions from our audience. Thank you so much for sharing your questions. Yeah, let's see. There's an interesting question here. So while talking about decolonization is important, nationalism doesn't help the cause of just drug policies either. In India, for example, we're currently experiencing that. So any of you has any reactions and has any responses or thoughts on how to address this dynamics, right? The rise of nationalism and of racism as well, I guess, to a certain extent. So any thoughts?
Yeah, and I definitely agree with the speaker that nationalism is not necessarily the answer, but I don't think any of us on the panel is advocating for just nationalism. What we're speaking of is whatever regulations you are putting in place has to take into consideration seriously the way of life of the people, the tradition, which is different from saying you're going to be nationalistic. And we have seen it in other agricultural products where the idea is to nationalize this product so that you can have protectionism. I don't think that that is what the traditional groups are asking for. What we're saying is take into consideration not just the national and the international perspective, but the cultural perspective that has possibilities to lead to development, whether it is nationally or internationally. So we're not talking about closed borders, being restrictive in a nationalist perspective, because nationalism does not necessarily, and I can use the example in the Caribbean, while we have the traditional groups and the traditional Rastafari and Maroons, you don't find that nationally these groups would be really accepted either. And so there are national problems that traditional, and I know Patricia will tell you our own experience in Latin America as well. There are issues nationally that the traditional indigenous groups face. So I don't think our argument is for a nationalistic movement, but a recognition that whatever rules or regulations we are putting in place must take into consideration the way of life of a people, especially those persons who are marginalized, which often most of the traditional indigenous groups are marginalized in their environment.
Thanks, Vicky. Thank you so much. We've received more questions, so let me ask the next one. Would addressing people's cultural rights also help people reach their economic rights? Who wants to start? Perhaps Silone? Sorry to put you on the spot there. Would you like to unmute your microphone? Silone? I think your microphone. Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, I also want to talk about that what the decolonized drug policy look like. I think it's just, yeah, the policy, the decolonized drug policy will be not target at smallholder farmers, the producer, and also
Oh, I think we lost him. Silone? It's too bad.
Because of the ban on the opium use, it's really affected the culture and also the local knowledge, the how to call the traditional medicine practitioner, yeah, their knowledge is almost disappear. So that that is the right that we should promote and also we should protect. So yeah, and then for the economic right, I think if you protect all the knowledge, I think it's, yeah, I think that so from that smallholder farmings, they can get income from, yeah, from growing the crop. Yeah, I think, yeah.
Great. Any addition, Patricia, perhaps? Or Rasaya Viv, if Patricia, you can go ahead if you have thoughts.
Yeah, it's just something very simple and very short. When you talk about cultural rights and economics, at least here in Bolivia, and I'm thinking about like everywhere, it's kind of it kind of goes together. So when we talk about coca leaf here in Bolivia and traditional rights and consumption and all kind of uses, you are talking as well about economics, about an important asset that has been the root of our economy and still does. So I would like not to confuse coca leaf with cocaine. That is another complete different speech or debate. I say it because I saw a question like going around the chat. So that's for the people that is listening to this webinar, that we are talking specifically about something that is nature, coca leaf as a sacred plant, as a cultural right that costed a lot of time, of lives, and of course the fight for the rights. So it's a completely different debate, just to be clear in that.
Thanks for addressing that as well. I've seen there are indeed several questions related to that, so thanks for answering that. Yeah, I just want to quickly go back to some of the points that have been raised earlier. Just a very quick question with regard to the blurred lines between non-medical and medicinal use for many societies and people around the world, right? I mean, if we look at legal regulation, I think the distinction with regard, according to the law or to the policy, has always been quite clear. And but in fact, for many communities, there's not really any clear line between non-medical or recreational or medicinal use. So I'm just curious to hear some of your thoughts with regard to this. And do you think this ambiguity hinder or propel the speed and quality of legal regulation? Vicky?
Okay, in terms of the blurring of lines between the medicinal and the cultural and recreational, again, it is how, it's a tricky situation, because I know it's a concern that we have here in the region, that what can be construed as recreational is all placed under the umbrella of medicinal for convenience, I'd like to say. And that to me is because we have not tried to understand or take into consideration the traditional usage. And the other element is, and which is something I keep plugging at wherever I go and speak, is the acceptance of traditional medicine. Before there was a modern day pharmaceutical type medicine, there was traditional cultural medicine and medicinal practices, from which evolved modern day medicine. And because we have not tried to understand and set the rules for these traditional practices, we lump some of them under recreational use, we lump some of them under no use at all, and we pull out what we call medicinal, what is modern day medicine with clinical trials and testing and so on, which, and for me, there needs to be that demarcation where, and we have had this issue, and I bring it back to the Rastafari community. Many persons think that the smoking of cannabis is not healthy, is recreational. But then in some cases it has found within their own community that the smoking can be medicinal and can be used, or the edibles or the extracts and so on. So again, it is how we try and understand both frameworks. I don't think that in fairness to say that they are the same, medicinal and recreational, they're not. And so we have to find a way to bring the science to the traditional and to accept the traditional practices and way of life and protocols overall.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Cylone, do you have any addition?
Yes, I think, yeah, as Vicky mentioned, it's quite very difficult to differentiate that it's a blur lines between the medicine and non-medicines and also cultural use. So yeah, for opiums, so usually people use is, one is for the medicinal use. It's one you get some illness that can be treated by. So usually people use for a short period, like so for 3 days, and yeah. So one is that, yeah, if you use more than, continuously for more than 1 month or so, so that will become an addiction. So yeah, that, I think that, so it's quite very difficult to differentiate that, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Yeah, yeah. I would like to read a question/comment from Myanmar. Yeah, I'm from Myanmar. I want to talk about cannabis. In Myanmar, cannabis is illegal, but cannabis has been used traditionally in the country for centuries. As such, recreational use of cannabis is usually tolerated in rural areas and increasingly in towns and cities too, but it is still illegal to cultivate and smoking it in the country. If one is found guilty growing it or smoking it, or even just with a few plants or cigarette, spliffies, the offender may be punished with a prison sentence of minimum of 5 years and can extend to 10 years. Do you think this is unjust? Patricia?
Yeah, well, it's kind of, Bolivia has this thing going around cannabis as well, because when we talk about what's the line between medical or non-medical use of some plants, I would say that here in Bolivia, it depends completely on the substance. So this question becomes easier or not to answer depending on the substance, because here, for example, the medical use of coca leaf does not include ages. It's something cultural. If you have a stomachache or a headache, either you are a boy, a girl, an adult, even children use it. You can chew it. You can have a tea, a coca leaf tea, and you will be feeling better sooner. But when you talk about cannabis, for example, that's completely impossible, because here we have no minimum consumption. So this is hardly penalized, really hardly penalized. A lot of people is in jail because of consuming cannabis. So I think the line is both legal and moral here in Bolivia, because cannabis is not a plant that we consider not at all medical, because we have kind of a prejudice with it. And when you talk about coca leaf, yes, this is culturally accepted, but as you can see, currently we have this kind of polarized discussion between regions and sectors of coca growers about the main coca leaf policy. But as I repeat, that's a whole other debate that we can go like for hours talking about that. But basically, this is the view when we talk about Bolivia and medical consumption.
Thanks, Patricia. Yeah, just quickly going through the questions. We've received more questions. Thank you so much for sharing all these questions, guys. And let me just ask this one question. Yeah, I mean, Vicky, I think answered it a little bit with regard to the UN conventions. Is it the fact that the UN conventions are extremely restrictive and not respecting each individual cultural or traditional uses of these plants or medicines? Or is it that individual nations are expected to abide by the UN conventions, which forces them to implement laws which inevitably go against their own culture or human rights? Would you be so kind, Vicky, to perhaps elaborate just a little bit on your question, on your answers here?
Yeah, what we find in the Caribbean, because of our small states and our size, we're constrained by size. So for example, Jamaica is 2.5 million people. St. Vincent and the Grenadines maybe another 100,000, if that many. And so what you find, we are heavily dependent on development assistance, and so on. So while we would have, and again, I refer back to our own local legislation or Dangerous Drugs Act amendments that give recognition to the rights of Rastafari for cultural and sacramental use of the plant, we still have to be very careful. We have been marked down by the UN Convention, by the reports, UN Job Report for this area. And so we have been very careful since then as to how we implement certain regulations. So we find that the aspect that deals with traditional and cultural rights, apart from that amendment that is left alone, we don't touch that because we do not want to contravene the UN to be blacklisted, because that has implication for how we trade, and that has implication for our remittances and cash flow in the country. And so what you find, because we're signatories to all these agreements, especially to the UN Convention, Jamaica is listed as one of the Caribbean signatories, we are careful with our local amendments. So we make no laws that will force us into contravening, especially if we do not have support of larger countries. So now what you find, our governments are now looking at Canada, because Canada as a country has decided to step out and go a different direction with recreational use. Now, or in between Canada and ourselves is North America, that has a federal law that says federally cannabis is still illegal and it's still not allowed to be traded. And so we are nervous and we have to be careful. So when we are making our laws and we're looking at our amendments, these are some of the issues within small island states, such as those in the Caribbean, that are heavily dependent on financial assistance that we take into consideration. Needless to say, now as well, we have the Chinese that are heavily invested in our Caribbean region. They have not signaled an acceptance of cannabis either. And so we have to be careful, because these are the groups that we meet at the United Nations. These are the countries with greater voices at the United Nations. And I think in answering one of the questions in the chat, I have indicated that what will make a difference though is with countries, with like-minded countries are able to come together and pull that group that can have our own, either have our own agreements or interstate agreements, or have a push at the UN to say, we need these laws to be amended. Unless that is done, we will continue having these small islands or individual states and countries struggling with laws such as these. So that's just some of my own thoughts on that.
Amazing, yeah. Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, I think in response to some of your points there with regard to trade, I'm just curious to hear your opinion, and maybe the others as well, with regard to intellectual property of traditional growers, especially with regard to seeds and certain chemovars of cannabis, in particular in this context of legal regulation that dominates the narrative right now. Do you have any thoughts on how we could ensure that traditional growers have, that they still have intellectual property over seeds and strains, especially certain, indigenous chemovars that are unique to certain regions? Would you like to respond, Vicky, very quickly?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, the intellectual property is important. It's something that we started looking at here in the Caribbean in terms of practices, cultural practices. One of the things that we were looking at was the Nagoya Protocol, in looking at how we would share those traditional and protect them, and how the communities could benefit from traditional practices, from traditional way of doing things and using certain plants. Now, that brings in itself an entire whole new discussion as to who owns, because this is a plant, a given plant. It's kind of art. So unless it's looking at the practice and the way of, either a way of growing or a way of extracting, there is pretty much that element that can be looked at. Now, in terms of the And what we find in that the traditional communities, and I give an example like Maroons, they try to hold certain secrets very close to themselves so that they don't, it is not stolen, so to speak, from them. It is not taken in a way where they do not benefit. And so what we're finding in the traditional communities is that is part of the not wanting to let people in. We talk about the colonial ideas and perspective. And we have had the experience with reggae music because it is felt that reggae music no longer belongs to us and we are not benefiting from it, even though culturally it evolved here. It is the same thing with our traditional practices and our traditional plan. And so we have to find a way. The rules exist in terms of the Nagoya protocols and so on, international, but how do we now bring the community to that knowledge for them to know what they can benefit from and how they can be protected within the traditional space. And so the discussion, it is another element of our conversation with drug plants, for want of a better word now. Part of that goes to the development perspective of our discussion. You have to be able to protect the rights while allowing persons to trade in these traditional rights and traditional ways of doing things. And so that is something as a group that we have to bring to the table. How do we protect our cultural rights while allowing it to be used, to exploit it for development in these various communities?
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Yeah, I have one last question to all of you, to all the four panelists. So we've heard that we're not going to be able to achieve the sustainable development goals with the current moves to legal regulation, in which there's a very unequal distribution of wealth and power and access as well. So we won't be able to achieve the SDGs unless we take into account various human rights, including cultural, traditional, and indigenous rights. So if you could give one piece of advice to the development sector, what would that be? Especially focusing on achieving the sustainable development goals. Who would like to start? Cylone?
Yes, as you showed, that's the most important thing is that to involve the farmers in the whole process of development. Yeah, it's not some kinds of development, it's just falling from above. So it have to start from the farmers. So listen to the farmers. Yeah, I think that is the important. Yeah. So another one, I also want to add another thing about the property right of the seed, opium seeds. So actually in opium seeds, we don't have much of that program to register for the patent right or property right. So actually the opium poppy is quite very sensitive plant. It's a response to the environment where it is grown. Yeah. So in opium, so mostly we talk about the morphine content. Yeah, the higher morphine content is the better variety. But actually, that morphine content is not from the seed. It's actually affected by the elevation, the climate, and also soil types. So I think we have to register the right of the locality right. Yeah. So in some local, it's the specific. Opium from the specific location have quite very high morphine content. So that will be, I think that.
Important, yeah. Patricia, would you like to share some final words with regard to SDGs?
Yeah, something really short that I already said, but for me is basic to understand and to improve whatever we want to improve when we talk about human rights. I guess looking at your people, learning from our own experiences when we are improving politicals or politics of forbidden plants. We have to just understand what are our most invisible needs, because what's happening now in Bolivia is that maybe we have forgot how or all the possibilities, all the things we can we can make, all the goals we can share, even with Colombia, with Peru. We just kind of forgot part of our history. So I think it's really, really important to deconstruct and pay attention to our structural problems and dynamics, to change them, to improve them, to even improve with some new ideas or some new policies that are really needed by now.
All right. Vicky, some very last words, very quickly.
Yeah, in terms of the SDGs, for me, I've always said drug policy should be viewed as a sustainable development policy rather than a war against drug kind of thing. Communities that participate in crops that are viewed drug crops participate because of economic development as well as for their cultural rights and spaces. And so how it is now that we are evolving into this trade, whether it's medicinal, recreational, whatever we are setting up in the future, culture, and how can we include these communities in that overall sustainable development? How can we see these crops for what they really are and for what the communities have culturally used them for over the years as development of their culture, of their own human rights and spaces. And so when we're talking about sustainable development, and one of my problems that I had with an alternative development project over in the Caribbean, it's how it was construed, it was seen as moving these persons away from cultivating drug crops or plants into other things. But why not engage them in the cultivation of these plants as part of their own development framework? And so development has to be modeled based on where we are looking at. Your development in Bolivia, in Myanmar, in Morocco, not necessarily mirrors my development in Jamaica and the Caribbean, because we have different perspectives, different cultures, different way of life. And so to sit at the UN and say this is your development model may be problematic. And so we need to get the development tweak to the spaces that we're looking at. And so the SDGs must take those fundamentals into concern for the true development.
Yes, amazing. Thank you so much for your brilliant insights and for sharing your experiences and recommendations and ideas for us to go forward. And thank you so much for all the attendees for coming, for participating. I wish we could go on for hours, but the discussion this discussion has to end, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll have more webinars coming. As you can see here on your screen, we have 6 more webinars. And on Wednesday, 7th of October, we will dive into the issue of corporate capture in the context of legal regulation. So as we move towards legal regulation of drugs, we risk growing the unaccountable power of corporations poised to exploit the drugs market. We've touched upon a little bit there today. And and of course, this will be done at the expense of small-scale growers and traders and other workers whose livelihoods have very much depended on this trade. So we will explore what can be done to support small-scale growers and traders and workers entering and competing in legally regulated markets. We will investigate what needs to happen to prevent wealthy corporations dominating the drugs trade and how we can avoid further inflating corporate power. We really encourage development sector actors who have worked on corporate capture to join us and participate. So please spread the word to your colleagues, networks, friends, family members, and join us for the rest of the conversation. Finally, drug policy is a development issue. We need to stop ignoring this fact, and we need to look forward to exploring this in more in depth over the next few months. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you all in 2 weeks. Take care. Bye.